they agree to my request, and I'm really humbled and thankful to them. So it has been a wonderful experience, sir. And I've been looking for the subject on this Antarctic Treaty, and I think you are I think, the first one, I think, the pioneer to take up studies on this subject, and that's why it attracted my attention. And I thought at one stage or the other, I will request you to please spare time for. I know it takes time. It takes.
I'm honored.
Yeah. So, sir, without I think taking much time, I would like to first express my thanks to you on behalf of the PRC and Foreign Policy School, and then I will request you to please go ahead with your presentation. But first, let me make you the host. Okay.
Right, sir.
A few seconds, sir. So, sir, now you are the host, and
Right.
you can share your screen. You can share the PPT.
I'll do that.
Yeah. Okay. Please go ahead. Yeah, it's very clear. It's very clear. We can see it. We can read it.
Right.
Yeah. So, sir, now it's up to you to begin the.
Thank you very much, sir. Very grateful to you in particular and the Foreign Policy School for giving me this opportunity and inviting me to deliver a talk on Antarctic geopolitics in India, emerging challenges and opportunities. I have been working on Antarctica for more than 2 decades now. And my MPhil dissertation was called Dawning of Antarctica, which was at Punjab University. And then I went on to do my PhD on Antarctic geopolitics, a new catalyst in international relations. My postdoctoral work was a comparative study of Antarctica and the Arctic. I was at the Scott Polar Research Institute at University of Cambridge in the early 90s. And it was at that time that I had the wonderful opportunity of visiting Antarctica on a small tourist ship called Ella Tarasova, which was named after the Russian actor. And we were just 100 of us. So you can imagine a very small ship with 100 of us on board. And I was expected to deliver a series of lectures on various aspects of Antarctica. So it was a great opportunity for me. I went to Antarctica, spent more than 4 weeks in the southern waters. We went to Buenos Aires, and then from there we went to Malvinas, Falklands. You would all remember the war that took place between Argentina and United Kingdom over the Falklands. And we traveled extensively. We went to different islands, Prince George, King George, Deception Island, Antarctic Peninsula, across the Drake Passage. And it was an incredible visit. The reason I'm starting with this personal biography and this visit to Antarctica is because when you visit Antarctica, and I hope all of you get the opportunity of going to Antarctica, it is the windiest, largest, coldest, farthest continent on the globe, but it is very much integrated to the rest of the global ecosystems. And it is a continent which is larger than India and China put together. So I think that is something that would surprise many students and scholars, because when they look at the globe, when they look at the world map, they would normally see an outline of Antarctica continent, and they miss out the point that Antarctica today is very central to the epoch, social geological epoch called the Anthropocene. It is heavily impacted by climate change. 80% of world's fresh water is locked up in Antarctic ice sheets, ice cap. It has huge minerals, and early 70s, the US oil drilling ship Global Challenger found evidence of oil and gas. So let us hope that the day does not come when all these resources will be, or somebody would be thinking of exploiting these resources from the continental shelf of Antarctica. At least I would hope and pray that this never happens. But you know that we live in a world which is characterized by resource scarcity. We live in this new era called the Anthropocene. We are all impacted heavily by climate change. The frequency and the intensity of natural disasters is increasing. And I can tell you from my own experience as one of the lead authors of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, Working Group 2 on Vulnerability and Adaptation, Chapter 10 on Asia, that if we do not respond to climate change, and I will show you a few slides later on, which will clearly convey to all of us that if climate change were to impact Antarctica, in the eastern Antarctica in particular, then the consequences for the rest of the globe can be really disastrous. So we will come to climate change later, and we'll talk about that at some length. But you would be intrigued to see that the slide that is right in front of you says, who owns Antarctica? Because it is hard to imagine that a continent which is farthest, a continent where we do not see human life, except that you have a number of scientific stations, you have scientists working on Antarctica, but unlike the Arctic, Arctic has indigenous peoples, but Antarctica does not have indigenous peoples. So who speaks for Antarctica and for whom Antarctica speaks is a very important question. And as we go through our conversation, you would see that this question will loom large, the question of representation. It has geopolitical implications, it has moral, ethical implications. So who owns Antarctica? There's a question mark. And can Antarctica be decolonized? So you will find these two questions intriguing, but they are at the core of Antarctica geopolitics. Today, they have been there for a long time. They have been there since the beginning of the 20th century, as we will see. And as we go deeper into the 21st century, as we move forward with the rest of the 21st century, this question, who owns Antarctica, is going to be with us. I don't know for how long, but it looks like it is going to be there with us for a long time. So let us start with this question, who owns Antarctica? Because when I wrote my book, 94, called The Polar Regions, A Political Geography, which was published by John Wiley and Sons, I did make a statement in that book, which I would like to share with you. I said that it is very surprising, and perhaps not surprising, that imperial colonial impulses traveled to each and every part of our globe, right? They traveled across the oceans, they traveled across the Indian Ocean, they traveled across the southern part of the Indian Ocean, Pacific, Atlantic, and they reached Antarctica. So between 1908 and 1942, we had 7 territorial claims made on Antarctica. Now, I hope you are able to see all these slides clearly. These are very important. This is a very important slide, because as you go in a clockwise direction, you will see that firstly, you have what is called the Antarctica Peninsula. This is the geopolitical hotspot, right? This is where you have three overlapping claims on Antarctica: Argentina, United Kingdom, and Chile. So this is, as I said, geopolitically speaking, the most complex part of Antarctica. As you go in the clockwise direction, you will see the Norwegian claim. Then you will see the Australian claim. 40% of Antarctica is claimed by Australia. Australia calls it Australian Antarctic Territory. Then there is a small strip of the French claim. Australian claim continues. Then you have the claim of New Zealand, and you have a part of Antarctica called the unclaimed part of Antarctica. So there was this race for the slice of the Antarctic pie, as this slide shows you. There is a very clear colonial imperial imprint on Antarctica. And that is the reason that my second question was, can we decolonize Antarctica? And when we talk about India and India's engagement with the Antarctic, these two questions are very important. Who owns Antarctica? Because as you will see later, India does not recognize these claims. India does not make any territorial claim. And India, one of the reasons as to why India has been there in the Antarctic Treaty System is not only to keep Antarctica peaceful, non-militarized. We will come to the Antarctica Treaty provisions, but India has always believed that Antarctica governance should be a democratic. We want to see a multipolar polar order, right? We want to see a multipolar world. India wants to see a multipolar world. And India believes that the multipolar polar world, both Antarctica and the Arctic, are very central to the larger project of having a multipolar world. And as we will see later on, that is the kind of vision which is also enshrined in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that our engagement with Arctic, our engagement with Antarctica is very much a part of that vision, right? So it's a scientific engagement, it is a moral, ethical engagement, and it is also a geopolitical engagement. So please remember this map, because we have to keep it at the back of our mind as we go along. Okay. Now, in 1959, something very important happened in the history of Antarctica, and that was the Antarctica Treaty. In 1959, Antarctica Treaty was being signed, and there were 12 original signatories, so to speak. There were 7 claimant states, the maps that you just now saw, plus US and USSR. So you might be wondering, why have I put US and USSR here? They are semi-claimants. What does it mean? They do not make claims, they do not recognize these claims, but they reserve all rights to make a future claim if necessary. So let us not talk more about this. It will become clearer as we go along. Now, 2 points we have to bear in mind in order to really appreciate India's early engagement with Antarctica in 1950s. One is that in 1956-57, there was something called IGY, International Geophysical Year, in which a number of countries participated in Antarctic science research. They set up their scientific stations. Russia was one of them at that time. And the gentleman's agreement was that after the IGY, International Geophysical Year, was over, all these countries will withdraw from Antarctica, right? Because it was only for science and scientific purpose that these countries were there. When Russia decided to carry on with their stations, there was something like a red alarm, a red alert. Remember, Cold War had started. We are talking about the Cold War, 1950s when we talk about. this decade, it was the Cold War decade. Antarctica was not immune to the Cold War, and Cold War had entered Antarctica politics via science. So science became, please note this, science became very early the currency of political influence in Antarctica and Antarctica governance. And that remains the case even today. I will cut the long story short. I will not tell you more about the Cold War aspects, except that Cold War entered Antarctica through science, as I said, and the Antarctica Treaty was a great achievement. 1959, it was signed by 12 states, 7 claimant countries, 2 semi-claimants, US and USSR, and Belgium, Japan, and South Africa. All of them had participated in the International Geophysical Year. So the treaty says that it is in the interest of all mankind that Antarctica shall continue forever to be used exclusively for peaceful purposes and shall not become the scene or object of international discord. It also said that convinced that the establishment of a firm foundation for the continuation and development of such cooperation on the basis of freedom of scientific investigation in Antarctica as applied during the International Geophysical Year accords with the interests of science and progress of all mankind. So these countries, 12 countries, made a promise to mankind that Antarctica shall never become an object of international discord, and it will be used only for peaceful scientific purposes. Now, in 1958, in the Indian Parliament, Prime Minister Nehru made an important statement, and then India's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Arthur S. Lal, also moved a resolution in the UN General Assembly saying that Antarctica should remain open and accessible for peaceful scientific purposes. There was a concern among Mr. Krishna Menon, among Mr. Nehru, that there is a possibility that Antarctica might be used for the testing of atomic weapons. So India in 1950s, very much driven by the vision Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, was very particular about keeping Antarctica, this huge continent, as I said, larger than India and China put together, for peaceful and scientific purposes. So I wrote an article, which you might like to see. It was published in the Polar Journal based on archival research called Rise and Decline of Antarctica in Nehru's Geopolitical Vision, Challenges and Opportunities of 1950s. And Mr. Nehru said, I quote, "We are not challenging anybody's rights there in Antarctica, but it has become important, more specifically, because of the possible experimentation of atomic weapons and the like, that the matter should be considered by the UN, the fact that Antarctica contains many very important minerals, especially atomic energy minerals, is one of the reasons why this area is attractive to various countries. We thought it would be desirable to have a discussion about this in the United Nations." So those of you who are interested in more details can read my article. Because Antarctica Treaty was just about to be negotiated and concluded, the Indian proposition in the General Assembly did not go very far. There was also an opposition to it from a number of countries. But Antarctica Treaty is important. It is the center around which the Antarctica Treaty governance takes place. Antarctica Treaty system has been built. Article 1, peaceful uses, purposes, freedom of scientific investigation, international scientific cooperation. And please note, Article 4 of the Antarctic Treaty does not abandon the claims. It legally freezes the claims. So these claims are legally frozen. Geopolitically, they are alive, will remain so, particularly as and when the minerals question comes up, which happened in 1980s, but they are legally frozen. So this is an important point. Nuclear activity forbidden, geographical coverage south of 60 degrees south, There is a provision for inspections by countries of different scientific bases and stations. Jurisdiction, south of 6 degrees south, I mentioned treaty meetings. There is something called consultative meetings, disputes between parties, modification, so on and so on. So these are the articles of the Antarctic Treaty. Article 4, as I said, deals with territorial sovereignty. There's an agreement to disagree, which says that nothing contained in the present treaty will be interpreted as a renunciation by any contracting party of previously asserted rights or claims to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica. A renunciation or diminution by any contracting party of any basis of claims to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica, which it may have, whether as a result of its activities or those of its nationals in Antarctica, or otherwise prejudicing the position of any contracting party as regards its recognition or non-recognition of any other state rights or of claims on the basis of claim to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica. So please bear in mind Article 4 of the Antarctic Treaty. And no acts or activities taking place while the present treaty is in force, which means that when India joined the Antarctic Treaty System in early 80s, became consultative party, soon thereafter, nothing that India has done or any other country has done shall constitute a basis for asserting or supporting or denying a claim to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica or create any rights of sovereignty in Antarctica. No new claim or enlargement of an existing claim to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica shall be asserted while the present treaty is in force. So very, very important provision. Now, it is also important to note, and I will quote here from Donald Rothwell, who is one of the leading experts of international law in Antarctica. And he says that this is an important statement. While the Antarctic Treaty System has significantly expanded in its scope, as you will see very shortly, and operation since the adoption of the treaty in 59, the reality is that it has remained moribund in the sovereignty jurisdictional paradigm of the time. Now, some scholars say that this has served the treaty well because some kind of a geopolitical equilibrium has been arrived at. Others will say that, well, this is very much colonialism in Antarctica. So the post-colonial engagement has not taken place because these claims are legally frozen. So to continue with this quote, while this may have served the treaty well and even have been an essential basis for the adoption of the treaty and its ongoing success, questions do need to be raised about the effectiveness of this approach in the 21st century. While there may be grounds for arguing that some members of the international community outside of the Antarctic Treaty System framework do acknowledge the international legitimacy of the Antarctic Treaty System, the fact remains that the majority of the international community are not parties to Antarctic Treaty instruments. And to date, the enforceability of these provisions has not been tested. Law enforcement in Antarctica, therefore, remains a considerable challenge for the Antarctic Treaty parties and also the international community. The gaps and weaknesses in the system are the ones which undermine the legal regime and ultimately impact upon the security of the Antarctic legal regime and management of the region. So, to give you just one example, the states which have territorial claims look at themselves as coastal states with maritime jurisdictions. But for others, those who do not recognize these claims, you have high seas touching the baselines of the Antarctica continent. So right up to the Antarctic continent, it is the high seas, because those countries, in India included, which do not recognize these territorial claims will obviously not recognize that there are any coastal states in Antarctica. So having said that, these claims are also linked to the very important aspect of effective occupation. How do you establish effective occupation in a polar environment? 6 months night, 6 months day, harsh conditions, coldest continent, high-speed blizzards. It's a challenging natural environment. Now, this has been done, effective occupation has been achieved through a number of means. Establishment of scientific basis, that is why science becomes the currency of politics. Other settlements, whaling, sealing, exploration. Norwegians did it, for example. Mapping and exploration, dropping flags, it happened during the Second World War, issuing of whaling licenses, establishment of post offices on the Antarctica Peninsula, births have taken place, marriages have taken place, cabinet meetings have been held on ice. So now the point is that, can you say that claimant states, by doing what they've done, including the conduct of science, have established their effective occupation? So, because obviously there will be no final convincing answers to this question, there will be no consensus on this question. The status of Antarctic territory remains disputed. So this geopolitical map becomes more complex because of these facts. Australia, New Zealand, Norway, France, and UK mutually recognize each other's claims. Chile and Argentina recognize each other's claims, but not the other 5 claims. As I've already mentioned, there are overlapping claims on Antarctica Peninsula, and no other state, most of the international community, most of the states in the international system do not recognize these territorial claims, but they're there. Semi-claimants, I've already mentioned, non-recognition of existing claims, rights, but you reserve rights to make a future claim if necessary. So God forbid if Antarctic treaty system comes under stress or strain, how would the non-claimant states react to that geopolitical reality? Is difficult to say. Vostok is where the Russian station is, and at the South Pole, where all these pie-shaped Antarctica claims converge, you have a big US base scientific base called Amundsen Scott base. Now, India, after 1950s, would enter the Antarctic treaty system by sending the first expedition, early 80s, you would remember. Operation Dakshin Gangotri was launched under the leadership of Dr. Zuhur Qasim. We established a scientific station called Dakshin Gangotri, which is now buried under snow. And in a very short time, Antarctica major powers approached India, persuaded India to join the treaty system, which India did, as I mentioned, but to begin with as an honorary member. And then in a very short time, record time, as India would like to, very much wanted to see it happen, India was given the consultative status. So I will show you a slide later on, which will show you the numbers of the ordinary members who do not have a veto right, and this high table of Antarctica, where you have the consultative members with full voting rights. And the Antarctic treaty system functions on the basis of consensus. Now, as I have mentioned to you, that among all the 7 claimant states, it is Australia which has sovereignty of over about not just 40%, but 42% of the continent, including sovereign rights over adjacent offshore areas. So you can see this map here. This is the Australian Antarctic territory. And the government of Australia is spending an additional $2.2 billion to protect Australia's significant Antarctic interest. This was mentioned in the 2017 foreign policy white paper. So Australia is a major actor, major claimant. Also, in terms of knowledge and expertise about Antarctica, Australia is a leading power in the Antarctic treaty system. This is the map of Australia's continental shelf confirmed by the Commission of the Limits of Continental Shelf of the United Nations. And when Australia and other claimant countries submitted these claims on extended continental shelves, they asked the UN Commission not to consider them actively. Quite obviously, doing so will cause unprecedented stress and strain on the system. It will, the understanding that has been arrived at in Article 4 of the Antarctic Treaty would also be seriously undermined. And please note that it is at this juncture that India officially wrote to the Commission, making it very clear that India does not recognize these territorial claims. So this is an important point which we really have to bear in mind, that India does not recognize these territorial claims. India does not make any claim of its own, and therefore, in the geopolitical vision of India, Antarctica is a global commons. The term common heritage of mankind, as we all know, has a legal connotation in the context of the Law of the Sea Convention. So you may use it, you may not use it, because it has a particular legal connotation. From claimant state's point of view, they would not be willing to consider this particular description for Antarctica. Some scholars like me have also been calling Antarctica as the global knowledge commons, saying that there is still a lot that we do not know about Antarctica, and that is the reason that Antarctica science remains the first order value. But I think there are very good reasons to believe that even when you have this reality, this geopolitical reality of claims, it remains a global commons. The entire globe has a stake in the governance of Antarctica. And as I mentioned to you, that the preamble to the Antarctica Treaty clearly says that Antarctica shall forever be used for peaceful scientific purposes. Now, it is important to bear in mind that there have been discursive transformations of Antarctica. What does it mean? 1956-57 International Geophysical Year, 1950s to 1960s, these are the two decades when the dominant representation of Antarctica was that of land of science. 1980s, things started changing in Antarctica, right? So in order to understand Antarctica geopolitics today, in order to understand one of the reasons, not the, but one of the reasons why India decided to enter the Antarctic Treaty System in early 80s, has a lot to do with the resource geopolitics in Antarctica. Remember the Law of the Sea Convention, third convention of the Law of the Sea, traditional fishing countries being pushed out of their major fishing countries being pushed out of their traditional fishing grounds, heading south, where you had enormous source of animal protein in the form of krill, which is a crustacean, very rich fishery resources. And of course, there were some who would remind you of the fact that in the past, many of these resources had been overfished, overexploited. And the first important instrument that was negotiated by the Antarctic Treaty powers at that time, it was still a small group. Please remember, when India enters the Antarctic Treaty System in 1980s, early 80s, till that point, it was very much a small group, exclusive group. Some would even call it a club of elites, scientists, privileged, claimant countries, semi-claimants, and others. So the first instrument was, as you will see a little later as well, CAMELA, Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And the resource geopolitics did not end here. CAMELA was established, headquarters in Hobart, ecosystem approach, bifocal approach. And as I mentioned to you, that the area of jurisdiction, Antarctic Treaty jurisdiction, is south of 60 degrees south. But in case of CAMELA, which is the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, you went right up to Antarctica convergence, which at many points crosses this boundary of south of 60 degrees south. And the idea was conservation. Conservation was defined as rational use. And then the next instrument that was being negotiated, which caused a lot of tension in the Antarctic Treaty system, related to the minerals. And you had the very intense negotiations of the minerals question. Why minerals? Who would have thought of exploiting minerals in Antarctica? Well, before that, as I mentioned to you, US oil drilling ship Global Challenger has come to Ross Sea. That they had drilled certain holes, found evidence of massive oil and gas. CIA prepared a confidential report, which was circulated, which was leaked out. And there was this dawning of perception that Antarctica was no longer just, it was a continent for science, no doubt, but Gondwana land hypothesis, minerals map was becoming more obvious. So this was a very important discursive transformation. There was a pro-mining lobby, pro-mining countries. And then by the time you had CRAMRA, Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resource Activities, reaching its peak, there was a crisis of consensus, because as I mentioned to you, the Antarctic Treaty System functions on the basis of consensus. India was followed in 1980s by China, it was followed by Brazil, even Pakistan set up a small base called Jinnah base, but then did not continue with its scientific program. And Antarctica Treaty, there's this understanding that any country which demonstrates substantial scientific interest in Antarctica can be considered for consultative status. So that has been sort of more or less the broad understanding. Netherlands became an exception later on without setting up a scientific station, and Netherlands became a consultative member. But overall understanding was and still is that you have to prove your sincerity and commitment and resources to Antarctica science, sending regular expeditions, setting up a scientific base, and so on. So no surprise that it was during the 1980s that you had a rush in terms of membership, as the next slide will show you. United States, Germany, United Kingdom on the one side, talking about the minerals regime. It was anticipatory. It was an anticipatory geopolitics that before it actually happens, let us put a regime in place, a regulatory regime, which will have very strict environment, very stringent environmental conditions or requirements. But then Australia and France, joined by France, took a turn. Some look at it as a U-turn, and decided not to support the minerals regime. There are several explanations for it. I dealt with some of them in my book, Polar Regions of Political Geography. But one explanation was that probably Australia was also not very happy, or Australia was unhappy over the absence of an anti-subsidy mining clause in CRAMRA, which was from one perspective understandable. The anxiety was that what if, for geopolitical reasons, certain countries decide to subsidize mining activities in Antarctica. So anyway, there was this crisis of consensus. It was resolved. To cut the long story short, I don't have time to go into all those details. There was a walkaway clause initiated by the United States, which meant basically that around 2048, let me come straight to the point, the Antarctic Treaty ban on mining will be up for a review. It's a complex process. I will not burden you with the details here, but it is important to bear in mind that if at that particular point in time, 2048, if there was another crisis of consensus, God forbid, then under certain conditions, a country could walk away. But let's hope that that doesn't happen. For reasons which are also, we can also have a discussion about that later on. But one of the reasons certainly is that the promise that you have made, the signatories to the system, to the treaty have made to the rest of international community, that science will remain the first order values. Antarctica will forever be used for peaceful and scientific purposes, and will never become an object of international discord. So, Madrid Protocol addressed the consensus crisis, and 1991 in Madrid, environmental protocol or protocol to the protection of environment, the Antarctic Treaty. And as you will see, I will show you a few slides later on, it introduced a very strong normative aspect into Antarctic geopolitics, saying that all activities, human activities on Antarctica, in the Antarctic, will be subjected to environmental impact assessments. We will come to that. We'll come to that shortly. But first of all, let's take a look at Antarctic Treaty consultative members. 61 to 70, as you can see, 12. 71 to 80, just 1. During the decade resource geopolitics, 1981 to 90, 13. Then 91, 2001, 2001 to 10, 1. 2011 to 18, 29 consultative parties, 25 non-consultative parties. And now it has expanded, as you can see, 54 states. India achieved, as I mentioned to you, Antarctic Treaty consultative status in 1983 in a record time. China followed 85, 2 years after acceding to the Antarctic Treaty, whereas India got it within just a few weeks. One of the reasons for that could well be the anxiety, understandable, linked to 1950s memory when Antarctica question had been raised by India in the United Nations General Assembly. In any case, it will be raised again by Malaysia around that time, question of Antarctica. Prime Minister Mahathir at that time felt that the interests of the non-aligned countries and the global south, the third world then, have not been duly represented. So there would be an annual debate on the question of Antarctica in the UN General Assembly. Till Antarctica, this Madrid Protocol happened, another discursive shift. Malaysia joined the system as an honorary member in 2011. Monaco joined in 2008. Pakistan joined 2012, Mongolia 2015, Iceland 2015, and Kazakhstan 2015. So this, broadly speaking, will give you an idea of how the Antarctic Treaty membership map has evolved. Now, this slide will give you an idea of the complexity of the Antarctic Treaty system. So you can see on one side, measures, resolutions, decisions of the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings. Now they happen once a year. Going back into the history, 64 agreed measures, 1972 Seals Convention, 1959, of course, I've already said this is the center of the entire system treaty. 1980 Kamala Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. 1988 CRANRA, not in force, overtaken by 1991 Madrid Protocol. And fast forward, as I said, 2048. Let's see what happens at that particular point in time. You also have non-state actors. You have ASOC, Association of Southern Ocean Coalition, which is concerned about sustainability issues, environmental concerns. You have IATO, so you have a big tourism industry now in the Antarctic. COVID, of course, affected it very badly, but post-COVID, we can again look at a very significant increase in the numbers of tourists, more than 70,000. When I went, as I mentioned to you, I was on a very small ship called El Atarasova, just about 100 of us. Now you're talking about very, very big ships. Antarctic, because of the Madrid Protocol, you have Committee on Environmental Protection. Of course, you have CAMELAR Commission, which is again a part of the Antarctic Treaty System. You have COMNAP, which is the Council of Managers of Antarctic Program. And you have a very important body, non-state actor, which gives scientific advice to the Antarctic Treaty parties, called SCAR, Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research. So as you can, then there's Antarctic Treaty Secretariat, which is set up, which is now currently in Buenos Aires. It was set up in Buenos Aires, and it's still there. Of course, when the Secretariat was being set up, it was not an easy question to address because Argentina is also a claimant country, as you know, and there are 3 overlapping claims on Antarctic Peninsula. But at the end of the day, everybody agreed, and consensus was that the Secretariat will be set up in Buenos Aires. It's a first-rate Secretariat, and one can go on praising it for all its achievements. Now, Madrid Protocol, I have already mentioned. Parties commit themselves to the comprehensive protection of the Antarctic environment and its dependent and associated ecosystems. And it is mentioned here that hereby designate Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. It has 6 annexes. Certainly, we do not have time to go into all these annexes. Now, among a number of challenging areas, there are some major challenges that Antarctic Treaty System is facing. And the reason I would like to spend a little time on this slide is to invite your attention to the fact that things have gone wrong in the Antarctic waters. It's a vast ocean. You can see all these accidents that happened. You can see the size of the ships as well. And you will see here a recent information paper that India presented. You might like to go to the website of the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat, and you will see a rich repository of resources. Those who want to do research on Antarctica, they will find all Antarctic Treaty documents, final reports. The last meeting was in Germany. I had the great honor of serving on the delegation. And by the way, I think I did start with that disclaimer, but let me also say that these views which I am expressing here in this presentation, although you read that, let me make it very clear that these views are not of any organization, Ministry of Earth Sciences, National Center for Pole and Ocean Research in Goa. These are my views as a scholar of Antarctic governance, Antarctic politics and geopolitics. So you will see that India has been at the forefront of the viewpoint that all human activities in Antarctica should not have more than minor impacts on the Antarctica environment, is dependent on associated ecosystems. And India has presented a number of information papers. One was presented in Sofia, Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, and more recently, as I mentioned, this IP 117. Now, because our focus is on geopolitics, we are looking at a very intriguing science, politics, geopolitics interface. I now want to engage you a little more with Antarctic geopolitics. At the core of Antarctic geopolitics, of course, is the issue of contested sovereignty. Tourism, the slide that you saw just now, is not free from that. In fact, there are various aspects of Antarctic tourism which are also of geopolitical importance. And more recently, we have seen what some scholars have also called polar Orientalism. As I mentioned to you, Antarctic Treaty does not abandon these claims, but they are just legally frozen. And we have seen a number of acts in Antarctica, performances in the Antarctic, which give us an idea of these nationalisms in the Antarctic. The source of this is an article which Alan Hemmings, myself, Elizabeth Lean, Daniela Leggett, and Dr. Salazar wrote in 2015 in the yearbook of polar law. So obviously the time doesn't allow us to go into each and every aspect of it, but let me give you just a few examples of how nationalisms in Antarctica are asserting themselves. Formally declared claims to territorial sovereignty, we have already seen that. A relative proximity of Antarctica to metropolitan territories, gateways to Antarctica, Argentina, Chile, South Africa, and Australia, New Zealand. All kinds of social and cultural associations. You can see them in the South American states. Regional or global hegemonic inclinations. Alleged need in relation to resources. Please remember that even if you have a ban on Antarctic mining the Antarctic, you have, under the Camilla provisions, very important fishing activity going on in the southern waters. I will not go into the details here. Contested uses or practices in Antarctica carry over from intense antipathies outside Antarctica. National pride in and mobilization through national Antarctic programs, infrastructure and logistic arrangements, denial or constraint of access by one's strategic competitors or opponents, and so on and so on. So we have seen, as I said, a number of very interesting developments. So just to give you an example, when I was in Ushuaia after completing the cruise in the Antarctic waters, one could see on the sandwich bags maps of Argentina, and there were these very interesting cartographic silences. So you will show your map, your boundaries on Antarctic Peninsula, but not the boundaries of others. And you know that the British Antarctic Territory, as it is called, it was also called Queen Elizabeth Land while celebrating the Diamond Jubilee year. China, which is a new actor, but very important actor, as we'll come to that a little later. If you go to China, you will see quite a large number of maps, pamphlets, even there. So I can go on and on, giving you lots of examples. Now, China as a polar great power, both in the Arctic and in Antarctica, China's presence has been growing substantially. And that has led to some anxieties and fears, and one such expression comes from this book called China as a Polar Great Power, Cambridge University Press. Anne-Marie Brady says, I quote, as an energy-hungry nation, China is extremely interested in the resources of Antarctica and the Arctic and any possibilities for their exploitation. Chinese language polar social science discussions are dominated by debates about resources and how China might gain its share. In Chinese language debates, social and hard sciences scholars, government officials, and journalistic commentators all appear to agree that the exploitation of Antarctica only is a matter of time and that China should prepare itself. Chinese preparations include ramping up its scientific programs as well as investing in social science research. So, number of scientific stations growing 4 to 5. China already has a polar icebreaker at its disposal. New plans are in the pipeline. So one can see that both in Arctic and Antarctica, China has substantially enhanced its scientific presence. And science, as I mentioned to you, remains a very important currency of geopolitics. So if you are looking at current and future challenges, please also remember that fisheries resource sustainability is a very, very big question. Krill, Patagonian toothfish. The problem of IUU, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing remains. More growing number of scientific stations, not very surprising. Science is the first order value. Antarctica is open to science and scientific uses. And it goes without saying that if you have to avert the tragedy of global knowledge commons, you need more research. There's absolutely no doubt about it, that you need more science. But it would be naive to assume, in my view, that science comes without geopolitical influence. In fact, some scholars have said, quite persuasively argued, that science remains the currency of geopolitical influence in the Antarctic. But also remember that the role of scientific, Antarctic science, beg your pardon, is also changing, particularly with biological prospecting. So, which is understandable, because on the one hand, you have biodiversity related research. On the other hand, you have potentially a very big industry, commercialization, under the peaceful uses of Antarctica, which is the biological prospecting. The subglacial Lake Vostok system, the grilling activities, and so on, also have their political and geopolitical implications. And as I mentioned to you, let us not forget that 80% of world's fresh water is locked up in Antarctica. Now, global climate change is another very serious challenge in Antarctica. It has moral, ethical implications, but it also has geopolitical implications. Instability of West Antarctic ice sheet, changes in Antarctic bottom water formation. And I think if you are keeping a track of what is going on with the tipping points in this new social geological epoch called Anthropocene, then there are reasons to worry. And as I said, that the question then remains a very important question: for whom does the Antarctica speak, and who speaks for Antarctica? So tourism, bioprospecting. Bioprospecting could become, in times to come, another very polemical issue in Antarctica. Who owns these resources? The question of equity, equitable distribution. It is indeed a very complex and compelling issue area. I want to invite your attention, because we are running out of time now. There's a book which I would strongly recommend to all of you. I've just reviewed it in this journal called the Polar Journal by McKay, Edmiston, and Marcus Howard, called The Future of Antarctica, Scenarios from Classical Geopolitics. I will just read out 2 paragraphs from here. First of all, please remember that, taking a clue from my own book with Professor Timothy Doyle called Climate Terror, A Critical Geopolitics of Climate Change, the fear of climate change is unfolding in a climate of fear, right? So that is the larger picture that we have to bear in mind. So in this climate of fear, one of the challenges that India faces in the Antarctic, other member states also face in the Antarctic, and all those who believe in greater democratization of Antarctica governance, while celebrating its achievements. After all, The Antarctic Treaty System has kept Antarctica, free from international discord, despite the crisis of consensus, which we saw in the case of Crimea. What does the future hold? It's difficult to say, but on the one hand, there are scholars, I belong to that school of thought, which says that let us remain hopeful. Let us continue to work towards the greater democratization of the Antarctic Treaty System. It has remarkable achievements. Let's keep those achievements. Let us make sure that from Antarctica, very strong normative appeal goes to the rest of the world with regard to climate change. Antarctica can become a very powerful catalyst for collective behavioral change. So let us remain hopeful. On the other hand, there are fears now, fears of all kinds. And one such fear, I quote from this book, fears are expressed that the Antarctic Treaty System may be unable to respond adequately to these challenges, or that major changes will be forced upon it. In particular, there is ongoing speculation about the future intent of China in the context of its expanding number of Antarctic research bases to 5, and its interest in commercial krill fisheries. China has also been identified as a potential future architect of a significant challenge to the Antarctic Treaty System when the Madrid Protocol comes up for possible review from 2048 onwards. How well-founded, ill-founded, both hopes and fears are, that is for the critical social scientists to explore and investigate. The ongoing success, another quote, the ongoing success of the Antarctic Treaty System, and here I agree with the authors, cannot, however, be taken for granted, particularly in an age of renewed great power competition. This new context, will likely require careful management with skilled leadership and commitment to consensus, as was needed first in the 1950s, then, which was the decade of the Cold War, and then the 1980s and 1990s, as I showed you, the resource geopolitics decade, when the entire system was under significant tension. So, as far as India is concerned and its Antarctic engagement is concerned, these are some of the challenges and opportunities. India, as a consultative member, we have absolutely outstanding science. There's no doubt about that. The Ministry of Earth Sciences, Dr. Ravi Chandran, who is also the Secretary of the Ministry of Earth Sciences and the Vice President for Capacity Building of SCAR, an eminent scientist. If you look at one of these slides here, India hosted Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting in 2007, which was a great success. And now we are getting ready after Finland. Next year, it will be in Finland. And I think after that, India will be hosting the next Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting for the second time. And India would certainly want to see that as we continue with our first-rate polar science at Maitri, Bharti, these are our 2 very important stations. We are also, as I said, philosophically, if you look at the philosophical vision, it remains that of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And I have said this on a number of occasions that when I went to Antarctica in the 1990s, I could feel that I was on a pilgrimage. It is so peaceful that it deserves. There is no other place on the planet Earth like Antarctica. Its beauty, its majesty. And at a time when the world is facing all kinds of challenges, geopolitical, ecological, climate change, disasters, the challenge that we all face is, and I think Indian diplomacy, Indian science, India science diplomacy, we have an Arctic policy, but we don't have the Antarctica policy yet. And I hope very soon we will see India's Antarctic policy, which is now badly needed, if possible, along with the polar ambassador, that India will remain committed, India will remain a voice of protecting Antarctica, a voice which continues to reinforce the preamble to the Antarctic Treaty, that Antarctica shall forever be used for peaceful and scientific purposes, because there is still a lot that we do not know about Antarctica. So before we get into another round of resource geopolitics, my own personal position is that Antarctica should be spared of this great paradox, in the sense that the resources, the fossil fuels which are responsible for climate change, should not become the reason for renewed interest in the polar regions, whether it is Arctic or Antarctica. And then we should also remember what Swami Vivekananda had said: all differences in the world are of degree and not of kind, because oneness is the secret of everything. Antarctica is connected to tropics, Antarctica is connected to the Arctic. Our monsoons, monsoon Asia, our future critically depends on what happens in the two polar regions, in Antarctica and the Arctic. The monsoons are going to be directly affected by these changes in the polar regions. So I think I could have continued for another few hours talking about Antarctica politics, Antarctica science, but I hope in this presentation, or through this presentation, I've been able to convey to you certain messages. And let me just sum up by saying that Antarctica stands globalized. We find that it is no longer the question of poles apart, neither Arctic nor Antarctica. Yet we should appreciate that the three poles, Himalayas, Arctic, Antarctica, hold the key to future sustainability. So it will be very tragic to lose the polar attributes, the sheer nature. As nature gets transformed into environment, and as nature and environment get subsumed under the category of climate change, we must not turn our back on the nature. One of the central messages or lessons of the pandemic is that when we talk about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, we are not only talking about the human species, we are talking about non-human species as well. And God forbid, if we do to the ocean, Southern Ocean, Arctic Ocean, Antarctica, what we have done to ecosystems on land, then I think we are heading towards a great disaster. And I can also say that by virtue of my very humble contribution to IPCC 6th assessment report as one of the lead authors of chapter 10, on Asia under the working group 2, that we have to acknowledge that we are faced with a very serious, unprecedented challenge of the Anthropocene. We need to pluralize Anthropocene. We have to also bear in mind the importance of the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. But there is also common in common but differentiated responsibility. The challenges of collective behavioral change. Antarctica should remain peaceful. It should not become a site of international discord. Mutual mistrust, fear, they should not come in the way of doing international cooperation in science in the Antarctic. We should strengthen the Antarctic Treaty System. And I think one of the great challenges that India also faces as a non-claimant country with its commitment to Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is, how do we further democratize the Antarctic Treaty System? It looks like nationalisms will not go away. It looks like territorial claims will remain geopolitically alive. How long is difficult to say. 2048 is not that far. But I hope that rather than being a witness to another round of geopolitics of resources, which might lead to another crisis of consensus in the Antarctic treaty system, let us move in the direction of ensuring that the territoriality, contested territoriality in the Antarctic, metamorphoses into some kind of trusteeship. It sounds like a utopia, but idealism of today can be realism of tomorrow. But that is the kind of philosophy, that is the kind of new Anthropocene geopolitics that Antarctica demands and deserves, along with the rest of the globe, of course. So I would like to end with this quote from Gurudev's Gitanjali, because I think one of the greatest challenges that all Antarctic Treaty countries face today, and the totality of the Antarctic Treaty system, and also the rest of the world face, is fear. And how do we ensure that the other of the fear, which is hope, remains in the driving seat as we move forward towards the 21st century, or towards the rest of the 21st century? The crisis in Europe, the crisis in Ukraine, has cast its shadows on the Antarctic Treaty governance, no doubt about that. It has cast its dark shadow on the Arctic Council. And the message is loud and clear that as all these disputes hopefully get resolved through diplomatic means, the challenge would be to ensure that the governance of these global commons does not suffer. So let me end, ladies and gentlemen, with this quote: where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country, and I would add humanity, awake. So thank you very much indeed. I would be more than happy to take your questions and listen to your observations and interventions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Professor Chaturvedi, sir. It was a wonderful session. And all that I can say that we listened to you with rapt attention. And actually, I was lost while listening to you on such a interesting subject, which has remained unexplored so far. And academics like you have done their best to throw more and more light on this subject. Before taking the questions answer session, I will ask the students to please introduce yourself and ask questions, and be quick about your questions and brief also. Come on, be quick.
Hello, Ria. I can't hear you. I think you have to unmute yourself, Ria.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Sir, I am Riya Sharma, and currently I am pursuing my master's in political science. Sir, I've read that although we have passed the Antarctic Bill, work has been rather or relatively slow from the Indian side, and at the same time, Russia and China have been using scientific research as an excuse to further their claims over the continent. Also, sir, there is this narrative that the Antarctic competition will soon resemble the US China or the US Russia rivalry as it is happening in the North Pole. So, sir, do you think that India needs to rejuvenate its approach or pace up just so that it doesn't become a matter of discussion for the big powers?
It's a good question, Ria. Thank you for your question. First of all, India's Antarctic Bill, it's a great news. Now we have the Antarctic Bill, which was very much needed. I also happen to be, I had the honor of making some contribution to that bill. And it was needed because it's a part of our international commitment under the environmental protocol. And this bill has given us the further momentum to our program. It has given us further credibility. It has certainly strengthened our profile. Now, you're quite right in saying that India needs to continuously work to ensure that India's voice, Indian perspectives are heard loud and clear in the Antarctic Treaty System. You know that Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings are very important platforms, and India has been active, but I think India can always be more active in terms of making its voice heard. You know, in the Antarctic Treaty System, we have a provision for working papers, information papers, participating in intersessional contact groups. And as I tried to convey to all of you that India has already made some important contributions along with other member states to the ongoing discussion on tourism. And I remain hopeful that India will soon come out with its Antarctica policy document, as we have done in the case of the Arctic. That is very, very important. We have been there in the system since the early 1980s. And the system is going to become more complex. Major power rivalries are affecting almost all international organizations today, right? Because we do see a geopolitical churn of a kind. But from India's point of view, it is very important that not only Antarctic remains peaceful, the preamble to the Antarctic Treaty, the system remains stable and robust, but it also gets democratized, which means that as far as I'm concerned as a scholar, I would like to see India continuing to make contribution towards what I call the post-colonial engagement with Antarctica. And that is not to suggest that you oppose, because we joined the system in 1980s. And the idea was that, and Malaysia decided at that time, now Malaysia is in the treaty system. Malaysia at that time, Prime Minister Mahathir decided that, or thought that it was a good idea to go to the United Nations General Assembly and discuss the question of Antarctica. Whereas India's position was that we are there in the system for scientific reasons, for ethical reasons, for political reasons, no doubt, geopolitical reasons. But we had a very nuanced approach towards Antarctica. And I think we should continuously ask ourselves, have we done enough in the Antarctic Treaty System? Science, perfect. I said near perfect. Science, we have achievements, remarkable achievements. But then we also have to remember that science has been the currency of political influence. And political influence, not in the negative sense, political influence also in the positive sense, because through science diplomacy, you can make huge contribution to what kind of Antarctica India would like to see, say around 2050. That is the time when, you know, if you take a futuristic approach, imagine what India would be in 2050. Looking at the trends, India is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. We have the demographic dividend. We are far more hopeful and confident today than we ever were in foreign policy and diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi, gave a very inspiring vision for the Indian Ocean called Sagar. You would also remember his keynote address and the Shangri-La dialogue. India is at the forefront of saying that we want an open, inclusive Indo-Pacific. We want a multipolar Asia. We want a multipolar world. But we also, as I said, we also want a multipolar polar world, polar systems. Polar ambassador, I think we should be thinking very seriously about it. Somebody who takes a holistic view of Arctic, Antarctica, because there's a lot of synergy, right? although Arctic and Antarctica, they have remarkable differences, but they also have remarkable commonalities. I think by and large, Antarctic Treaty System countries would want to keep these rivalries as far away from the system as possible, right? As possible. Because remember when there was a Falkland War, at that time, Argentina and United Kingdom continued to talk in the treaty system, right? Of course, on the Falklands, Malvinas, there are differences of opinion which both the countries express in the Antarctic Treaty meetings. It has become an annual feature. They will say, and then again discuss matters of common interest in the Antarctic. So I really hope that major power rivalries, power shifts will not negatively impact the Antarctic governance. But for that, you need collective wisdom, you need efforts. And I'm confident that India will remain at the forefront of that thinking about Antarctica. Let us keep it open, accessible, land of science, used for peaceful and scientific purposes. But as I mentioned also in my showing you a few slides, there are some geopolitical challenges which we will have to face in the times to come.
Sir, there's one more question.
Oh.
Sir, as you said that we live in an era of resource scarcity, and we see there's already a resource competition over the Antarctic, and global warming has already been affecting the Antarctic ecosystem. Also, sir, as we saw in Bali COP27, that it is more and more difficult for countries to arrive at a consensus when it comes to global warming or climate change. Sir, in such a scenario, how can we prevent Antarctica from becoming a battleground of big powers? I mean, sir, can't we bring in a stakeholder approach where we can outline the stakes as well as the responsibilities of each country? I mean, there has to be some policy rather than having a stateless Antarctica.
Stakes are there. You see, it's not that there are no stakeholders, stakes are there. In international relations, we also know that there is hierarchy. There's a concept called anarchy, which is lack of global governance. And one solution to anarchy is, of course, regionalism and regional organizations, right? They even if you can't have a global governance, you have regional governance. And we still have a situation in Antarctica where, despite the fact that a very large number of countries being represented, we still have most of Africa, for example, not being directly represented in the Antarctic Treaty System. So there's still the question of who would represent whom. Industry has entered Antarctica. In peaceful uses, we have tourism. And as I mentioned to you, tourism also has certain geopolitical nuances. So when you are in the system and you are trying to regulate tourism, you every now and then you will face the geopolitical reality of Antarctica, right? So on the one hand, you have the ecological reality, moral, ethical questions and issues. At the same time, you are faced with power political realities and geopolitical realities. That is the reason that Antarctica, future of Antarctica should not be left to the hands of just a few countries. It is very important that you democratize the system in such a way, because it works on the basis of consensus, remember. So any country, big or small, if so long as that country is a consultative member, it has a veto. It can. Now the point is that is the reason that I've always argued in my own work. Don't have silent delegations in Antarctic Treaty System. Don't have. Silence breeds suspicion. Silence also sometimes shows disinterest. I would like to see an Antarctic Treaty Consultative meeting where everybody speaks. Of course, there are challenges. The duration of the meeting has been reduced. Agenda is getting very, very crowded. And international diplomacy, has its own nuances. But At the end of the day, what is important is that voices of not just state actors, but also civil societies, NGOs, global civil society, all voices should be heard in the Antarctica narrative. It is not easy because we know that, there is always a tension between power political impulses and the moral ethical considerations. But if there are lessons to be learned, if we are willing to learn lessons from, say, the ongoing pandemic, the COVID, I think the lesson is, as I read it, that if Antarctica governance, for some reason, runs into trouble, I don't think there'll be winners. There'll be losers. The only point is who will lose more, who will lose less. So you have reached a point in Antarctica governance where it is in the collective interest. Now, claimant countries, some scholars will say that, look, the positive side of the claims is that it makes it more, how should I say, it can generate more resources from your governments, because you still have nationalisms and you have territorial nationalisms. But I think at the end of the day, even the claimant countries will be forced morally as well as politically to think about the manner in which they should go about their contested territoriality. I think, it is my utopia, but I always say that let the claimant countries in Antarctica become trustees. Let all the consultative members become trustees of this. Let us hold Antarctica in global trust. Now, that, of course, would require very difficult choices. 2050, will you allow oil and gas exploitation in Antarctica? On the one hand, you're talking about climate change. You're talking about sea level rise. I did not show you a few slides, but remember 17 meters of sea level rise is locked up in Antarctica ice or ice caps. So if you read the SCAR, Scientific Committee Antarctic Research Report on Climate Change, you will realize the stakes that we have in the Antarctica. So there should be a very powerful normative appeal going from Antarcticans. I call them Antarcticans. They are nationals, yes. There is nationalism, but there is also universalism. To the rest of the world, including their own governments, that we cannot afford to lose, the Antarctic and all that it stands for. So we will have to see. We'll have to see how the future unfolds.
Thank you so much, sir.
Next question. Come on, be quick. Any other question?
I don't see any.
Okay, actually, you have explained everything in so detail that there are hardly any queries, because queries arise when things are not explained comprehensively. So I take it that way. But I have a few queries like a student. I become a student at the end of this question hour session. My first query is about, you have spoken about tourism in the context of this. Do you see that destination weddings are going to be reality in near future? Yeah.
Well, in case of Antarctica Peninsula, we have seen ceremonies being performed. We have seen even childbirths, but that is also having a very political and geopolitical angle. I mean, I see no issue with, for example, a wedding taking place or a tourist ship going to Antarctica. Before the pandemic, the maximum number, which is understandable because the tourism from China, the Chinese tourists, their number is also now increasing. But that is the global tourism industry. So there's no specific reference to this country or that country. But The point is that you're talking about 75, 80,000 tourists, and the number is growing. Now, there's also a challenge of search and rescue in the Antarctic, in the Southern Ocean. There's a number of accidents have taken place, and countries have helped each other. Countries do reach out to each other, and it is not an easy operation at all. So one cannot rule out these possibilities. They might happen. They might happen on the ships. They might happen on shore. So one cannot rule out that possibility. I think it can happen. It will happen. But I'm more concerned about and also so are the Antarctic Treaty gateway states and other countries, that the search and rescue operations. There's adventure tourism now in Antarctica, and regulating Antarctica tourism is becoming is a challenge, because, for example, should we have permanent infrastructure for tourists on Antarctica? Is still being debated. And because there are claimant states, there are non-claimant states, there are semi-claimant states. So even the discussion on tourism sometimes acquires a political connotation.
You are right to a certain extent, and I'm afraid about the findings of oil and gas on this continent. What we are seeing in Ukraine now, and role of major powers. I mean, about this oil and gas exploration and supply chains and all that. Do you think that such a contingency may arise in the case of this continent also, when it is allowed?
I don't see it happening in near to medium future. 2048 is still into the future, and I think in Antarctica Treaty, the treaty powers, the major actors and others are also aware of the fact that the entire system is based on rests on a very delicately maintained political, legal equilibrium. So if there are scholars who have the fear that dual-use technologies might come to Antarctica, right? So there is this concern that you never know whether Antarctica, non-militarization provision of Antarctica will hold forever. That is the reason that I showed you that slide from Antarctica, classical geopolitics, scenario from classical geopolitics. So there are concerns, there are some kinds of anxieties as well. But I hope that at the end of the day, good sense will prevail, as has happened in the past, and there will be no crisis of consensus. And then 2048, the Madrid Protocol says that before you lift the ban on mining, you have to have a very strong regime in place, right? Like CRAMRA. CRAMRA was about regulating Antarctic mineral resources, but the idea was to put in place such stringent environmental conditions that it will become extremely difficult for any company or any country to mine the continent. So I think, sir, a lot will depend on how global geopolitics evolves in the times to come. But I think most of the countries in the Antarctic Treaty System, vast majority, overwhelming majority, including major powers, would be very reluctant to rock the boat, so to speak. Nationalism will remain. I mean, you will see them here, you will see them there. You will see science will remain a very important currency of geopolitical influence. But I think the main stake would be to keep the system intact. Now, the danger can be that the system remains, right? But it becomes hollow out. This is called, some scholars have called it hollowing out of the system, which means that the system is there, the countries maintain it, but whether it will be effective as we would want it to be when it comes to bioprospecting issues, for example, and other issues, That we will have to see. We'll have to wait and see.
Thank you, Chaturvedi Sahab, for such an scholarly exposition of views on such an important topic. Actually, I've been looking for this topic, and who else could have, I think, satisfied us by such exhaustive coverage of the issues? Because you have been a pioneer, I know, and that is something which we value very much. So, once again, thank you very much for your time, and you have very kindly agreed to our request. We hope to have your guidance in future also, whenever occasion arises, and we will certainly like to be in touch with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And good night, everyone. Thank you.
Okay. And with your permission, I would like to close the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.